all loads, electrical loads, have to be fed electricity in order to operate. They can't operate without electricity. Yet because we only teach about electricity and not about electrical reactance, we just assume that the circuit must die eventually because all it has to work with is electricity. Well, that's so bogus, because electrical reactance is not electricity. It's the fragmentation of electricity, or the near fragmentation. In other words, if you pull something apart as much as you can before it breaks down into its fragmented components, if it's still holding together as electricity, then it still functions like electricity, except really, it's still electricity, but it doesn't function like electricity. It functions like electrical reactance. And this is the beauty of how we deal with electrical reactance. It's like a rubber band. We stretch electricity almost to the breaking point, and it becomes electrical reactance, yet we can still use it in the circuit because we've joined the components of electricity, namely inductive reactance and capacitive reactance, into a loose association such that it's not exactly an electrical association, it's a quasi-electrical reaction, quasi, in that it is mostly electrical reactance by its nature. And in that state, it becomes very malleable, very moldable. We can play with it and change its parameters of containment. We're changing the container when we modify electrical reactance. We don't mess around with the contents. The contents is electricity. And yet, the container can become the contents, and the contents can become the container. This is called power correction factor. Electrical engineers already know all this stuff. But they call it by different names than what the liberal thinkers like to call it by, but it doesn't mean it's something different. It's the same thing. So they know how to do the conversion of changing the container into the content, or the content back into the container. The container is the fragmentation of electricity, or almost the nearly fragmentation, while the content, it's solid, it's in phase. The current is in phase with the voltage, and there's no degrees of separation between them in time. So in time, so when you get a rise of current, you get a rise of voltage at the same time. When you get a fall of current, you get a fall of voltage at the same time. That's electricity. And that has to obey the laws of thermodynamics and the conservation of energy, in which it dissipates itself. And that's called entropy. But when you get electricity stretched nearly to the breaking point, you can go all the way such that the current is out of phase with the voltage by 180 degrees, by a whole half cycle. Now, we're not talking DC here, we're talking AC. So when the current rises and reaches its peak, the voltage falls and reaches its lowest point. And likewise, when the voltage rises to its highest amount, the current falls to its lowest amount. When it's in that state, you get negentropy, you get negative resistance, you get current seemingly appearing out of nowhere. Now, where is electrical reactance located? It's actually located in capacitors and inductors. Because when you look at the formula in a simulator for how it responds to a voltage potential placed across either the two terminals of a coil or the two plates of a capacitor, it's a very interesting set of mathematical functions they use in a simulator in the software code. It's the same mathematical formula for electrical reactance, namely capacitive reactance for a capacitor and inductive reactance for an inductor. It's not entirely all the code, but it is a major chunk of it. And it has to do with modeling. How do you model a coil or model a capacitor in a simulator? Mathematically speaking, you model it by creating a current source. Now, a voltage source is a source of energy in which the voltage never varies. The only thing that's allowed to vary is the current, and you use resistance to make up the difference. Meanwhile, in a current source, the current stays the same, whatever you set it to, but the voltage is allowed to vary, with resistance making up the difference, because Ohm's law has to be followed in all of this. Now, for what it's worth, it goes further than that. In order to construct this current source inside of an inductor or a capacitor, they use electrical reactance formula. And when you look up the article on Wikipedia on electrical reactance, there's actually impedance, also resistance, that has to be figured in. And it's not simple resistance of a resistor. It gets a little bit more complicated because it has to do with frequencies affecting the resistance. So when you get a higher frequency or a lower frequency, the resistance can change. But be that as it may, when you look at these mathematical formulae, you start to realize that the voltage that was applied across the two terminals of a inductor, of a coil, what comes out of it is current determined by inductive reactance. And when you get voltage applied across a capacitor, the two plates of a capacitor, what comes out of it is the discharge at a rate which we call current, because current has to do with rate and voltage has to do with potential difference between two points in space, two terminals or two plates. So the rate of current coming out of a capacitor is capacitive reactance. It's governed by the mathematical formula of capacitive reactance. Now, there's always some resistance in a coil. A coil is a length of wire, let's say 1,000 meters long, and we shorten its length by coiling it. Well, we still possess the resistance of that 1,000 meters of wire at a certain gauge. So if it's a very thin wire, it has more resistance to current, and when it's a very chunky, stout wire, it has less resistance to current. But regardless, the resistance is still there, the simple resistance. We've just shortened the length of the wire by coiling it. Now we've also got inductive resistance as well, and that's of course back EMF, but just simple resistance is already there in the coil. And then in a capacitor, there's something called equivalent series resistance. Well, it's hard to call it by the same resistance because it's like running along and you run into a wall and you hit your head against the wall and you fall flat on your face or flat on your back, because the capacitor is a wall. It's a resistor at 90 degrees to your flow of current, stopping the flow of current. Yet it's a rubber wall, which it's slightly rubbery, so it allows for bounce. It allows for discharge backwards, but if it's a small capacitor, it becomes like a prism and allows some of the bounce to go to the opposite side and get sent forward. And this is why capacitors are used as filters for various frequencies. But be that as it may, electrical reactance is in all capacitors and coils, and because it's there, serving as a source of current, oddly enough, even though it's the resistance of the coil and the resistance of the equivalent series resistance of a capacitor will normally be positive resistance, diminishing the current, but not all the time. Sometimes it acts like a negative resistor, based on that other video of stop wasting batteries. So where was I? Phase relation. So we've split apart electricity, or we've pulled it apart. Usually coils and capacitors pull apart electricity by 90 degrees, and they get the current and the voltage out of phase by a quarter cycle of an AC cycle. And the beautiful thing about it, let's just look at the beautiful difference between them. A coil, this is conventional knowledge taught to any conventional electrical engineer. A coil displaces current from voltage by slowing down its reactance to current. Meanwhile, the voltage gets ahead by 90 degrees. Meanwhile, a capacitor is the opposite. It accelerates the current, or shall we say it slows down the voltage by 90 degrees. So this shows already that it's electrical reactance built into caps and coils, but they never really push that idea. They just say, oh, the voltage lags the current by 90 degrees, or the current in the case of a capacitor, or current lags the voltage by 90 degrees in the case of a coil. They just say it that way in conventional terms. They never insert the term, oh, it's because of electrical reactance. That's the reason why the electricity is getting pulled apart by a quarter cycle of an AC cycle. Well, a resistor puts it back together again. It can't help but put it back together again. And oddly enough, there are lots of different resistances. A light bulb is a resistor. A heater is a resistor. But a spark gap is also a resistor. This is weird, because normally we think, oh, Tesla, spark gaps, negative electricity, oh my God. Yeah, but they're also resistors. Oh, it's a little confusing and complicated with spark gaps, but just for the sake of making this talk a little exciting, I thought I'd throw that in. Anyway, if you take energy that is pulled apart by a coil or a capacitor and send it through a resistor, it gets put back together again. Only inside the resistor, though. Once it goes through another coil or capacitor, it gets pulled apart by 90 degrees all over again. What was the last thing I wanted to say? Oh, darn. Oh, so let's say we have a situation in which we've managed, and I'm not going to explain how it's done because that's complicated, but let's say we've managed to pull apart electricity by 180 degrees, a whole half cycle. So now instead of the consumption of energy, we are producing energy. That's the way electrical engineers look at it. So they say, oh, electrical reactance never separates by 180 degrees because we're not allowed to call it that. Because we're only allowed to recognize the consumption of energy, namely thermodynamic slowing down of energy. And we're never allowed to think of negentropy, of negative resistance, the generation of free energy in a circuit. So we just assume that 180 degrees phase difference between voltage and current does not exist. Because if it did exist, we give it a different name and shove it under the rug and hide it. We call it a generator. Rather than calling it a load. See, now a load is a positive resistor in that it soaks up energy and makes it disappear and throws it out to the environment as heat or mechanical energy, and we lose the electrical force in the circuit because of its positive resistance. We call it a load. It's all name playing. We play games with words. And then when it's negative resistance, in which the current and the voltage are 180 degrees out of phase, we call it a generator of electricity. Oh, isn't that fun? Gee, boys and girls, we get to play hide and seek with the truth. Okay, now I'm going to stop now because I'm so emotionally warped. And it warps the mind talking about it. I can't even think straight anymore about electricity. If I start talking about it in conventional terms, I screw up my brain so bad I can't even think about it in a holistic fashion. Now, what we can blame is the compartmentalization of a professional life. Society is so highly technically advanced that in order to get training on any subject, we cannot be a Renaissance man. We cannot be a Da Vinci anymore, or a Michelangelo, or a Charlie Chaplin, in which you are capable of doing many different things. And you can complete a whole project all by yourself if you want to. No, you have to send it along the assembly line of corporate America, in which somebody else takes care of some other aspect of the production of your artifact, because you only focus on one thing and they focus on something else. And so you never see the whole picture, you never get the truth. You don't exactly get a lie, but you know what happens in a vacuum? Nature abhors a vacuum, right? We start to fantasize, or somebody fantasizes for us on our behalf. Advertisers are very good at it, at filling our guts, I should say, with platitudes that are not true, and they don't have any liability. And they have a lot to do with the say-so of how society is engineered to work the way it does, in the way of platitudes that are not even true. Because they have no liability. They're not scientists. They're just selling a product. We know they're paid to lie. So it's their job to be the front man to lie to us. We don't have to blame government or whatever. Just blame advertisers. They're right out there lying to us all the time. And we go, oh, that product looks good, let's buy it. Meanwhile, you're buying something else. You're not only buying the product, you're buying the lie that sold it. The lie that electricity, you have to pay for it through the nose, work your butt off night and day to pay your electric bill, or else your lights get turned off and everything else gets turned off, all because they managed to sell you a way of life. And no other way of life is allowed to exist. So, I guess I got to buy into the theology that goes with the sale. Okay? You got that now? How do I turn off the recording? Oh, here it is.